A new Bloomberg report suggests an off-duty pilot fixed a system malfunction aboard a Lion Air flight just one day before that plane crashed in October. In the report, Bloomberg says the pilot, who was riding in the plane's jump seat, right? He's one of those deadhead pilots that sits in the jump seat and is not there to actually fly the plane. He stepped in when the crew began battling for control of the aircraft.
Witnesses say the plane climbed and dropped by hundreds of feet. So Anthony Roman is the president at Roman & Associates and a former corporate and commercial pilot, and joining us now. And Roman & Associates is an investigative
intelligence firm.
Correct. Right. Yeah. So you're our guy. So we have been talking about what's been going on with these 737 MAX planes. And as we get more information, we have almost more questions. So now we have this report that the day before the Lion Air crash, another pilot who was off duty had to step in because clearly the pilots in the cockpit didn't know what was going on. And I thought I heard another report where the pilots during the Lion Air crash, prior to it, they were going through the manual looking for information. I'm not sure. You know, I should clarify. I'm not sure if it was the Lion Air flight or another flight. But clearly, some of these pilots were not trained well enough on the 737. What stood out to you about this report?
Well, a non-flying pilot has an advantage. He's not struggling with this 350,000-pound, 500,000-pound behemoth that is bucking like a Texas Bronco. So he has a broad perspective of what's happening. He can observe the pilot actions, observe the reaction of the aircraft, and then with his technical knowledge can then begin to solve the problem, remediate the issue at hand. They were very lucky to have a non-flying pilot on board, or I think we would have resulted in an earlier accident.
So a number of people, in fact, we spoke to a member of Congress last week who, and this is, we get the early initial stages of the investigation, but we're already pointing at the pilots, the lack of training that they may have received from their airlines, not from Boeing, and, you know, suggesting that because they were in Indonesia or in Africa, that was somehow a factor in this. And I guess the question that a lot of people are going to have is, was it pilot training or lack thereof, or should the planes not have been flying at all?
Well, it's both. It's a question of the software being too aggressive in its pitch down mode and in the background actually resetting itself every time the pilot temporarily disconnected it, and acting more aggressively with each subsequent event, eventually pointing the nose down so far that it was unrecoverable at low altitude unless the system was shut completely off. Now, there's where the training element comes in. The system has to be shut down completely. If not, it resets. The pilot manual and pilot reports to the NASA safety reporting system reflected that the manual was wholly inadequate and almost criminal in its lack of information concerning the MCAS system. And that captain was wondering, if this is working behind the scenes and I know little about it, what else is working behind the scenes that I don't know about? So it created a lot of concern. There were additional pilot reports prior to Lion Air, U.S. carrier captains, that reflected that they had nose pitch down problems, missetting of the auto throttles by the automated system during the takeoff phase, during the most critical portion of flight. Very dangerous. All of this not reviewed by the FAA.
So that is my question.
Yes.
We, the people, depend on the FAA to protect us. Who is the FAA getting their information from? Are they strictly depending on the airline industry to self-report?
Boeing. And frankly, it is kind of telling that Ethiopian Air decided to send the black box for analysis to France
instead of the US?
Instead of the FAA.
There seems to be a lack of confidence in the FAA as a result of the criminal investigation and the civil investigation that's going on. And that's reflected by the global grounding of the aircraft prior to the FAA making the decision to ground the aircraft, and new European agency consideration of non-standard regulations that the U.S. does not have, which could affect the future certification process. The FAA had been the global standard at one point. What happened? Prior to 2005, for decades, self-certification was part of the process and very, very safe. It worked. However, the aircraft of old are not the aircraft of new. They're far more complex today with millions of lines of code. And in 2005, there was a watershed political moment where the FAA, along with Congress's approval, granted greater autonomy to the manufacturers to self-certify their aircraft and select their own engineers to report to their own executives on the self-certification process before it went to the FAA. Now, the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation in 2012 revealed that the FAA was not properly monitoring Boeing during the certification process and was allowing them too much latitude. It doesn't appear that any action was taken.
Wow. So real quick before we let you go, in about 30 seconds, the FAA, speaking of, President Trump has nominated Stephen Dixon as head of the FAA. Does it make sense to you for a former Delta Airlines executive to run an agency meant to oversee airline safety?
I think this is a terrific appointment. Dixon is a U.S. Air Force Academy graduate. He's an attorney. He's a bona fide captain, having flown the A320, the 727, 737, 757, 767. He headed for Delta the safety program and training qualification programs for 11,000 Delta pilots globally. So I think fantastic choice.
So he's qualified.
Yeah, that makes me feel good.
Yes. Anthony Roman, so great to have you. Really informative discussion. Please come back and share more with us as we learn more about what's going on with these crashes. Thank you.
So coming up in our next